I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about the life of theory and knowledge. This paper analyzes the form of the development of theory/knowledge by first examining the parameters which can be used to quantify that form and then the modes of possible development. Theory development can be studied by just examining a single theory's development. However, since this theory is unspecified, it can represent any generic theory. Hence, it can also represent a theory which encapsulates all specific theories, that is, a theory of knowledge. Insofar as this meta-epistemological study is a study of specific theories, it is meant to be a study of the development of theory in general, making it a study of the development of knowledge. This study does not claim or require that theory/knowledge follows any particular fixed developmental pattern. The value of this study precisely arises from its agnosticism towards progress or regress or any pattern in between of knowledge. Instead, it explores possible modes of development and posits parameters which can be used to characterize these modes. By simply thinking theoretically about the form of theory/knowledge development through its parameters and modes, we can achieve insights into the development of theory/knowledge. Parameters. Figure 1 is one possible mode of theoretical development. It represents Hegelian dialectical progress. However, at this stage of my analysis, it is meant only to serve as a generic representation of a possible mode of theoretical development. We will use this representation to introduce parameters and features to aid understanding of any specific mode. Axis. First, the axis. The dependent variable Q is the quality of knowledge. The independent variable T represents the passage of time, which is unidirectional. That is, it can only proceed towards the future, though we can examine the past from the standpoint of moments subsequent to it. The origin marks the 0 point for both knowledge and time of conscious human thought. No conscious human thought means zero knowledge, since there is no thinking being to cognize knowledge. T0 hence does not represent the moment of creation such as the Big Bang, or even the creation of man, but the first arising of consciousness in human beings. Prior to this moment, human beings, though alive, have no conscious thoughts. They may be able to mechanically and instinctively respond to the stimulus of their environment, but have not yet begun to wonder. When they do begin to wonder, that marks T0. This first moment of consciousness may be contemporaneous with birth or even at some point during the unborn fetus's development in the womb, since it is possible that the fetus is conscious of its environment. It can be when Adam was first given the spark of consciousness by the divine, or sometime subsequent to that event. It is a mythical moment. I have no theory on this, but we have to start somewhere. That somewhere is T0. Intensity of transition. Subsequent to that moment of first wondering, human beings develop some speculative ideas as to how things are as they appear to be. Say a mosquito landed on our first human being and delivered the first ever sting to our species. She felt a tiny pain, reached down and struck her shin out of pure instinctive physiological reaction. She peered into her palm and saw a flattened insect. She cognizes a link between the pain, the small, now dead creature in her palm, and the itch and swelling that has begun on her shin. This set of links or relations is a theory. She has developed a theory, possibly the first theory ever. I have depicted this first theory development as almost instantaneous, but it could just as well have taken hundreds of stings to different parts of the body by different insects for a primitive human being to make the necessary connections to form a theory. Say it took 10 days of experience and thought before she was ready with a theory. Say her first theory, 10 days later, was that the pain came from under her skin and the swelling and itch arose from her slaps to that spot. After all, insects move fast and are small. Even though she saw something flying away, she did not realize that it was an insect, that insects could bite, and that the flying object was a biting insect. She still has not realized that the external world can affect her, and so she thought the stinging pain was internal. While we as a distant and enlightened audience know that she got her initial theory wrong, we can understand why she had reasoned that way, and how she had derived her theory. There are elements within that theory that had been logically worked out, such as the connections she made between the events, even if they are on hindsight wrong. There are also elements that carry over to the true theory, such as how pain requires attention. Hence, on her process of reasoning, which is the epistemic dimension, and on the extent she got the facts right, the ontic dimension, she can be scored on a scale. Let us set the scale at 100 if the theory is the correct theory, and 0 if the theory is devoid of any factual or rational elements whatsoever. Though it is rather hard to get it all completely wrong to merit a 0, since even myths may contain some degree of rational thought. To score a 0 may require quite a bit of rational effort to concoct up pure nonsense, probably something completely irrelevant or incoherent, like, why did she smack her shin? Clouds. In figure 3, the dotted line represents the 100 where the theory is completely correct. In figure 1, this 100 is marked AK, which stands for absolute knowledge. AK is where we have complete and true knowledge of everything, a theoretical limit posited by Hegel. Let us say that she scored 7 over 100 for her initial theory. We can then arrive at an intensity of transition, del1, in this case between the 0th point to her initial theory of 0.7 per day. More generally, intensity of transition equals the quality of the nth theory minus the quality of the nth minus 1 theory divided by the time of the nth theory minus the time of the nth minus 1 theory. The theories can be consecutive ones, theory n minus 1 and theory n, between two theories with several theories in between them, or between the onset of consciousness and the final correct theory, theory C. On the level of knowledge, del AK equals to 100 divided by the time taken from the onset of consciousness to AK. For some time, say 15 days, our primitive friend stuck to her initial theory, which makes it the dominant theory. Then she managed to smack dead one of the mosquitoes that had been plaguing her. We have to remember, mankind has yet to develop a theory of insects biting stings or mosquitoes. All that she does realize is her experience of a small stinging pain, which later itches. However, after seeing the dead insect on her palm, she formulates in her mind a new theory. That thing stung her, and that was the cause of the pain and the subsequent itch. This time round, she took just 5 minutes to transit between her initial theory and her new theory. If we consider this new theory to be the correct theory that explains the phenomena of insect stings on human beings, then del C equals to 100 divided by 10 days plus 15 days plus 5 minutes, which equals to 3.9994 per day. From this simple example, we can derive our first insight. Insight 1. The shorter the time required to get to the correct theory, the more intense is the development of knowledge. The inverse relationship between duration and intensity is purely mathematical and is a consequence of the equation of the intensity of transition. A corollary of Insight 1 is Insight 2. The longer we are stuck on initial theories, the longer it takes to get to the correct one. In the case of our primitive woman, it took her time to connect the dots. She needed to undergo further experiences to make the connection between what may at first appear to be disconnected events. On the Humean account of my portrayal of events, it took her multiple stings to link cause, which is the mosquito, with effect, which is the pain, the itch, and the swelling. Her mind, her consciousness, needs to undergo further experiences to realize that when such a sting happens, itching follows. That is, for her to discover induction. She needed to observe the presence of little flying objects around the time of the stinging pain. She needed to intuit that the outside world can cause hitherto unknown sensations on her body. Hence, it is understandable that it took her some time to get from the onset of consciousness to the formulation of her theories. Linear simplification. I have portrayed this transition phase as a straight line, but that is only a simplification or an approximation. Those 10 days was not a steady increment of knowledge. If we zoomed in and tried to depict the knowledge growth in that time, it would have its own fluctuations and not always in an incremental progressive direction. As depicted in figure 5, she might, for instance on day 5, have had irrational thoughts on the phenomena, where she thought perhaps the sound of the river related to the sting. This is a decline in knowledge quality. In addition, the intensity of her knowledge development might sometimes be rapid, sometimes slower, or even be stagnant, for instance when she is asleep or is not thinking about the phenomena. That is, she is inattentive. It might deteriorate when she forgets the previous steps she had made about thinking about these things. Inattention is a stagnation of knowledge development. To accurately depict inattention, it should be a dotted horizontal line indicating a discontinuity. The point is, the sloping lines representing transitions between theories are simplifications, best understood as just connections on graphs rather than a linear relationship which can be interpolated to obtain knowledge quality levels. Likewise for the horizontal sections which represent theories, they are not actually horizontal. Within these phases, the theory continues to develop. For instance, our primitive woman may be discovering that the itch she is experiencing is seemingly soothed when she uses her nails to scratch them. She experiences relief from the irritation of the itch, though it returns upon cessation of her scratching. Similar to transition zones, there might be increases in her levels of knowledge when she draws correct relations and makes further discoveries while still operating within the limits of the prevailing theory. Deteriorations when she draws incorrect or irrational ones, and periods of stagnation from inattention. It is better approximated by a wavy line, though I will keep it as a horizontal line to avoid confusion with transition phases. Insight 3. On the broad level, approximations of knowledge development in transition and stable theory phases may appear linear, but they are, when zoomed in, non-linear. Additional parameters such as the number of steps needed to reach the correct theory or absolute knowledge can be read off by the number of theories between the original point and the final correct theory, or AK. While this seems to be an easy parameter to figure out, we shall see that in certain modes it will be hard to make such a count due to discontinuity in theory development. Turning points. I have not dealt with what constitutes a stable theory, only artificially representing it with horizontal lines in the graph where the turning point between the transition phase and the theory is a sharp one. Such a point, labelled C in figure 5, is in reality not a sharp point. It is unlikely to happen in an instance of time. We are unlikely to even recognize that such a point had been reached while it was occurring. We only recognize it ex post, and to depict it as a sharp turning point is a simplification and an approximation. More measurements around turning points are de rigueur in scientific experiments, conducted in laboratory conditions and replicable. However, in the real world, such measurements can only be approximated, and any fine detail may be lost due to a lack of documentation and recording. In addition, our thought process may be noisy and ambiguous, making the theory development process likewise noisy and ambiguous. It is noisy to the extent that there are other informationally irrelevant signals overlaid on informationally relevant signals. Relevance here is relevance to the theory being developed. Some thoughts or signals may be completely irrelevant. For instance, as I develop this theory of the life of theory/knowledge, the thought of lunch may surface. Not only is this thought irrelevant, it is a distraction which pulls me away from continuing to think about my theory. Ambiguous thoughts or signals may be vague inklings I have but at the moment lack the words for, or ideas that are still poorly defined and hence ambiguous. Like I have a vague notion how Popper's idea of falsification may be relevant to this paper, but I'm not quite sure how. It might just be a noisy signal, or it might directly lead me to thinking about Kuhn's theory of revolution in scientific paradigms, which is directly relevant. Or it may indirectly lead to how Popper advocates openness in society, how that relates to Marx, which then relates to Hegel, Hegelian dialectics being a strong influence in my theory. Such ambiguous thoughts can also come from non-related sources. For instance, playing some Baroque music on my piano may lead me to think of the sharpness of turning points for theory development. We can only be somewhat ambiguous when describing the ambiguous. But the point is, turning points are not sharp, well-defined moments as suggested by the graphs. Besides, if theoreticians are obsessed with recording every twist and turn in their thought process, they may be so caught up in minutiae that they fail to make their theoretical breakthrough, analogous to a combination of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the observer effect. The uncertainty principle states that one cannot know both the position and the momentum of a subatomic particle at the same time. If you know one, you cannot know the other. The observer effect is how the act of observation perturbs the system being observed. If the thinker is recording down every thought of his when he is thinking about an idea he is trying to develop into a theory, he might be so caught up in the recording that he fails to then develop his theory. By observing all of his thoughts, He might become so distracted by their appearance that he is thinking of the thoughts he is observing rather than the object he is trying to think about. He gets trapped on a meta level. Insight 4. Increased measurements and detailed documentation of the thought process may cause the breakthrough insight to be lost. Modes. Mode 1. Folk conception. Hegelian dialectical movement 1. I began the paper with figure 1 reproduced and extended below with more stages. It is a continuously upward rising trend with no decline. It depicts steady progress, with each new theory being a progress over the previous one. I consider this mode as a folk conception of theoretical development, since a common understanding people have of knowledge is one where we are moving ever onwards and upwards. Such a mode can be also thought of as representing Hegel's dialectical movement. A theory, thesis 1, after some time is negated to give rise to a new theory, antithesis 1, after which aspects of both theories are retained alongside new ideas to give yet another new theory, synthesis 1. Synthesis 1 is the new base thesis, thesis 2, which undergoes the same dialectical process to give antithesis 2. Both thesis 2 and antithesis 2 are then synthesized into synthesis 2, and the process continues until absolute knowledge is reached. The antithesis in this model has a higher knowledge quality than the thesis it is negating. This is because for the antithesis to be a viable new theory, it needs to be an advance on the previous theory. The synthesis, by taking the relevant aspects of both the thesis and the antithesis, is clearly an advance on both these stages and hence has a higher knowledge quality than either. Mode 2. Hegelian dialectical movement 2. However, it can be argued that the antithesis has a lower knowledge quality than the thesis it is negating. There could arise a need for a new theory, or antithesis, to replace the prevailing dominant one, or thesis, as anomalies that it is unable to explain accumulate. For instance, the geocentric model of the universe was the prevailing theory when it began to face increasing difficulties in explaining deviations. A new theory was needed and hence an antithesis arose when Ptolemy, born in 100 AD, introduced epicycles to fix the geocentric model. However, this new theory, this antithesis, had less coherence and explanatory power than the original theory, with the application being ad hoc and hence is judged to have a lower knowledge quality than the original geocentric theory. Finally, a new thesis, which incorporated elements of both theories, the thesis and the antithesis, arose to give rise to a synthesis. This was Copernicus' heliocentric model, coming some 1,400 years later. Lest I be remiss, some remarks are due. 1. An antithesis is not a strict opposite of the thesis. As explained by Julie E. Maybe, the term used by Hegel is entgegensetzen, literally to set over against. Hence, the negation is not necessarily oppositional but simply different, something to set over against the former theory. Hegel's development of knowledge also considers the dialectical movement to be a process internal to itself. I allow for new information to enter into the process. This is not necessarily inconsistent with his theory, at least at the level of total knowledge, since total knowledge will include all information, though it is inconsistent on the single theory level. 2. What constitutes a new theory? Are epicycles an addition to the prevailing theory since it is an improvement on geocentrism, or is it a separate theory altogether? What constitutes a new stage of theoretical development, and what constitutes simply variations and minor improvements within the same theory? One possible indicator is the change in knowledge quality. If the change is minor, then it can be considered to be within the same theory, and if the change is significant, it can be considered a new theory. 3. I've depicted Ptolemy's antithesis to be of lower knowledge quality. While Ptolemy's epicycle modifications to the geocentric model did improve the accuracy of the astronomical calculations, it required ad hoc injections of epicycles which lowered the systematicity and coherence of his theory. To determine the knowledge quality requires some judgment by the epistemologist, trading off accuracy versus elegance and simplicity of theory, in addition to the aforementioned hindsight. 4. The synthesis is, according to Hegel's account, a new theory which retains elements from the earlier thesis and antithesis. In the case of the Copernican revolution, where the reference frame is totally different, introducing literally a new way of looking at the universe, it is not entirely clear what elements have been retained from the preceding theories. This, however, is a problem for the Hegelians and not for the analysis of the modes of theory development, which only describes the development and hence is not obliged to explain it, though I do furnish some explanations to aid comprehension of the various modes. Any truly revolutionary new theory, where previous paradigms are discarded altogether and are considered incommensurable with a new one, presents this difficulty for Hegel's theory of the dialectic. We will examine this mode later since it introduces radical discontinuities. We have yet to exhaust the basic modes which are continuous, though as we shall see in the next mode, are not necessarily progressive. Mode 3, a random walk, is not in line with Hegel's dialectical progress, though his idea of Aufhebung, of sublation, where there is negation and retention as theories develop, continues to hold. Mode 3, random walk. What if mankind's intellectual development is not one that is progressing towards a higher level, but instead is a random walk? Newer theories have different difficulties and flaws from previous ones, and it is not clear that they are an advance in terms of knowledge quality. I had earlier suggested Ptolemy's epicycles as an example, and we can imagine further refinements that could perhaps improve the quality of celestial calculations, but require more and more ad hoc injections. Or imagine our primitive woman who, instead of sticking to one theory, kept spinning new ones. Her first was that the pain came from within, her next was that the spirits wanted to punish her, her next that the spirits wanted to reward her, her next is that each time a bird sang there would be a stinging pain. In hindsight, we know none of these to be true. We may judge each to be of varying knowledge quality, but the newer ones are not improvements on older ones. There is no building upon previous theories, they are simply different. Mode 4, negative knowledge. There might over time be an upward trend, perhaps as our primitive woman began to become increasingly rational, or a downward trend because of her increasing madness, or it could just oscillate without a clear up or down trend as I illustrated with the random walk mode. It could in theory fall below the axis, that is, enter the domain of negative knowledge, where one indulges in myth, the supernatural and superstition, which is not only untrue but harmful to truth, since it inculcates irrationality, hence giving it a negative knowledge quality. The modern version of this is fake news, conspiracy theories, and systematic theories built off false presuppositions or false evidence, which then sets our quest for knowledge back. They might even stifle the birth of new theories and stupefy our minds with fantasies and make-believe taken for truth, leading to an increasing decadence. Mode 5, Theory Revolution. At this point I return to the notion of theoretical revolution. The blue track in figure 10 is the original line of theoretical development. At some point in time, a new track, indicated in orange, begins, with a completely different approach from the blue track, making them incommensurable. It at first has a lower knowledge quality, as it is not as well developed as the blue track. It develops in tandem with the blue track, though separately, and later surpasses the blue track in knowledge quality. The blue track continues its development even so, until the evidence for the superiority of the orange track convinces the theoreticians to switch over, leading to the eventual extinction of the blue track and convergence to the orange track. Another possibility is that the blue track remains in play, as it is regarded as sufficient for some purposes, though it is not as general and encompassing as the orange track. One example of this is Newtonian mechanics, which remains in use even after physicists recognize Einstein's general relativity to be the correct theory of gravitation. Newtonian mechanics remains sufficient to describe terrestrial phenomena and is still the primary physical theory underlying mechanical and civil engineering. It also has further theoretical development in its paradigm. Why is knowledge in the case of revolution not depicted with the same line? The earlier modes all depict theory/knowledge developing as a continuum. They develop in the thesis-antithesis-synthesis way, even if in some modes, the later theories have higher or lower knowledge quality. The later developments build on earlier ones, even if it's not always progressive. Theoretical revolution does not take place that way. It is informed by earlier theories but has its own terminology and conceptual basis. It is so different as to constitute a revolution in theoretical development. Hence, to depict it as a separate track is clearer for purposes of representation. Mode 6, Diverging Tracks. While revolutions either converge or, in the example of Newtonian mechanics, continue to enjoy progress as a separate track, there can be diverging tracks such as conspiracy theories which take on a track of their own. Conspiracy theoretical development have positive knowledge quality since they often do contain some truths which give them a semblance of credibility, at least at first. They may even increase in knowledge quality as new theories develop in the conspiracy track, though they are inferior to the orthodox track, since if they are superior, they would not be conspiracy theories but the actual theory. What characterizes conspiracy theories is their tendency to decadence where they deteriorate over time. Other modes exist, but they seem to be of minor importance or of logical possibility but not actual possibility. Concluding remarks on the existence of absolute knowledge. An underlying assumption behind the analysis of the life of theory/knowledge is that there exist higher levels of knowledge quality which humanity can strive towards, at least in some of the modes. It is what is symbolized by AK on these graphs. However, does AK even exist? Is there a set of complete and absolute truth in the world about everything that we can know? In addition, if there does not exist absolute knowledge, can there exist perhaps not a complete absolute knowledge, but in some domains can there indeed exist absolute truths? For instance, in the domain of ethics and politics, perhaps there is not one right answer for all time, one best and universal ethical principle which we can turn to when in any doubt on how to live or conduct ourselves. What works varies with the context. There perhaps is no one best way of governing that will suit all peoples across all time, differing cultures and socio-economic conditions. Hence, in the domain of ethics and politics, there may not be an absolute knowledge. There may be no AK, no one best, correct and universal way, but how about in the sciences? Could we not learn the truth on the nature of matter or how the universe began? If there is no truth to aspire towards, what does this mean for the endeavor of science? Is AK a regulative goal? Regulative in the Kantian sense to mean not a real thing, but a notion that is good to have so that it helps us behave in the right way. Without such a goal, where is science headed if not in a random walk between theories that are no better or worse but simply different? Without a real limit which is AK, can knowledge quality have value and meaning? If there is no absolute level, no absolute fixed point to measure against, how then can we say that one theory has more knowledge quality than another, even in hindsight? I am not making a skeptical argument. There is an argument that we do not have and cannot have knowledge at all. There may be some knowledge we can have, such as what our senses immediately tell us, such as I see a red object, which is true, though it does not necessarily imply that there is a red object there, since this red object which I see could be a hallucination or in a dream. We may even permit mundane truths such as there is a red object there, but from these, it is hard to tell how we can get at the atomic structure of matter or the laws of general relativity. There may be logical truths such as the principle of identity and the principle of non-contradiction. There may be some a priori truths such as cogito ergo sum. I use the verb may since even what seems to be definitively true may not be so. Some have argued against the principle of non-contradiction and how there must be a thinking being if there is someone doing the doubting, to greater or less effect. Indeed, if one contradicts what are taken to be unshakable truths, it speaks precisely how there might be no absolute knowledge, and hence we do not know where we are on the scale of knowledge quality even in hindsight. The idea of such a scale then becomes incoherent. Insight 5. Without the limits of absolute knowledge, we cannot judge where we stand on knowledge quality in an absolute way. Whether there is truth and what is its nature remains an open question in epistemology. Even if we accept that there is absolute knowledge, we may not be able to reach it due to the limitations of human intellect to ever be able to achieve that level of knowledge. However, truth is not everything. There are norms and conventions we have created which can simply hold and which in fact govern many aspects of our lives without having some kind of universal truth behind it, such as those surrounding marriage or crime and law. Marriage in some societies is defined as between a man and a woman, period. As if there are no alternatives such as marriage between a man and another man, or a woman and another woman, or a person to a non-human object such as an animal or cup. Norms in marriage include monogamy as opposed to polygamy. Incest is forbidden, and a marriage contract dissolves upon death of one member or divorce, instead of continuing even after death. But why has that to be so necessarily? No epistemic reason really. It is just a norm somebody or some group of people had decided on. As for crime and law, murder is forbidden, Except in war, where killing the enemy is not only permitted but laudatory. That one crime deserves 10 years in jail while another just 5, or the death penalty. That voting is permitted at the age of 21, but not a day before, as if there was a sudden leap in ability to decide between one day and the next, are just a matter of man-made conventions. More innocuous instances are crossing the road on green and not on red. But why? Simply because it has been decided by the authorities to be so, or to remain so. It is a convention, and while there is much to say about the harms that some unjust laws can bring, for the most part, they are just decided upon to be the norm, such as driving on the right side instead of the left, or 3-pin electrical plugs instead of 2-pin. These last two examples show that there is no universality in such norms, since not every country does it the same way. There is no absolute truth to help us decide between 2 or 3-pin plugs. What we do have in such situations are standards. Say our country has adopted 3-pin plugs as our standard. 3-pin plugs then form the limit or the 100th mark of knowledge quality with regard to electric plugs, and any other type of plug can be scored with respect to how closely it approaches the standard of 3-pin plugs. Our norms and conventions can be taken as the standard of which other norms and conventions can be measured against. Likewise, even if we do not know our current theories are absolute knowledge, we can use them as our standard to measure other prior theories. We can accept that there might be an absolute knowledge which has not and might never be achieved, leaving it on our graphs as an ultimate limit, while scoring other theories using our current ones as the standard to measure them by. This, however, means that such assessment of knowledge quality are relative ones, that is, relative to the dominant theory, and are not absolute measures. As new and superior theories get developed, which surpass the knowledge quality of the current dominant theory, these become the new standard by which the knowledge quality of previous theories will be judged against. Hence, our method of graphically representing theory knowledge can still be applied. Insight 6. We need not achieve absolute knowledge to be able to judge previous theories. We can judge them against the current dominant theory. These will then be relative assessments of knowledge quality. Dominance and dogmatic tyranny. A dominant theory can, however, suppress the emergence of newer theories. Because of its widespread acceptance, the reluctance of theoreticians to consider newer ones because their work and hence careers have been based on the dominant theory, or satisfaction with the status quo, since if it's not broken, why fix or replace it? New theories may face difficulty in gaining acceptance even if they are superior in knowledge quality. Examples include the aforementioned Aristotelian celestial physics, which dominated until the time of Copernicus, thanks to the support of ecclesiastical authorities. It dominated for roughly a period of 1,800 years, give or take a couple of centuries. A mistaken achievement of AK can lead to the same complacency, preventing the emergence of newer theories and our ability to reach the true absolute knowledge. Another obstacle to absolute knowledge is dogmatic stagnation. This is where theoretical development gets stuck at more or less the same level short of AK. This happens when the dominant theory is accepted to be AK, or is considered the correct theory, after which all developments have to be based on this theory, with no deviations or even questioning tolerated. The onset of dogmatic theoretical tyranny need not happen at the start of the dominance of that theory, but can take place subsequently due to authority, such as political, ecclesiastical, academic, or institutional authorities. Extinction. Even if the development of knowledge continues untrammeled, be it stagnant, progressing, or regressing in knowledge quality, it might grind to a sudden halt, a complete discontinuity should an extinction event occur. Such an event is not necessarily an extinction of all life forms, but just of conscious life, since consciousness is a prerequisite for knowledge formation. Even if there are artifacts of knowledge remaining such as books, art, machines, or architecture, without conscious life to cognize them, knowledge becomes irrelevant. Fractal behavior. I return to Insight 3. On the broad level, approximations of knowledge development in transition and stable theory phases may appear linear, but they are, when zoomed in, non-linear. If we did zoom in on transition and stable theory zones, we will observe the various modes of possible theoretical development. It can be thought of as similar to fractals, whereas one zooms in, further patterns occur. It, however, differs from fractals in that these further patterns do not necessarily follow the same mode, but can be any of the different modes. The specific mode will depend on the specific theory under development. descriptive and not predictive. In conclusion, these graphical representations of the life of theory/knowledge are not intended to be predictive but are instead descriptive. We can only draw such graphs based on our current view of past development, charting the development by scoring the quality of theory/knowledge at each moment of time over time. The closer the intervals of scoring or signal measurement, the closer we get to the actual representation of the theoretical development. The further the intervals between signal measurement, the more inaccurate the graphical representation, though the broad trend might stand out more clearly. This is due to signal aliasing, a term taken from wave and signal analysis in mathematics. Insight 7. Representation of the life of theory/knowledge are merely descriptive and can only be done from the vantage point of hindsight. Insight 8. The more measurements, the more accurate the depiction. The less measurements, the broad trend may be more obvious. However, we have to be warned. The corollary of these two insights is, Insight 9, extrapolation of any prevailing trend to predict future trends would be a mistake. Thank you. Please subscribe to the Philosophical Bachelor channel, and if you wish to support the channel, you can do so at worldwideweb.patreon.com/philosophicalbachelor.